Within a lot of families that we work with, some amount of achievement tends to be a value. There is definitely a way to align with that value of achievement while also not saying like all A's or nothing. And one of the tools that I think is really helpful for that is actually focusing more process goals rather than achievement goals.
Welcome to Courage Class. I'm Dr. Lindsay Kwok Hugh, and each week I'm in conversation with our community's changemakers and trailblazers. Together, we explore the unspoken parts of our Asian and Western experiences, finding strength, growth, and healing that reflect who we truly are, not who we've been told to be. I'm so glad you're here. Class is now in session. Laura, thank you so much again for taking the time to be with us. I want to go ahead and introduce you. This is Dr. Laura Berssenbrugge. She is a licensed clinical psychologist and a registered yoga teacher. And in her private practice, she helps clients create real sustainable change through a warm, evidence-based approach that builds on her clients' strengths. She's the co-founder of the Modern Asian Parent. It's amazing. A movement and community that is based on honoring cultural roots while breaking harmful cycles to build healthier, more connected families for the future. MAP provides parents with the tools that we need to raise resilient, well-balanced children without losing our identity or our values. It is so important. Parenting is the hot topic in our house right now. We have 3 children.
I'm sure.
My husband and I, we're both in therapy and we're trying really hard to do things different. And what I mean by that is we want to be able to parent in a way that honors both our Chinese side as well as our American side. So he's second generation. I'm a third generation Chinese American, but there's no guidebook out there. And so we are so grateful and so excited for MAPS really lighting the way for us and helping us to really understand how to blend and honor both sides of us.
Oh, I love that, lady. It's heartwarming, and that's exactly why we founded MAP also. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
I love that. Thank you so much. Before we dive in, I'd love for listeners to get to know your journey to clinical psychology and to the founding of MAP. Would you share a little bit about, your pathway into that and how you started MAP?
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in Hawaii many moons ago at this point, and I discovered counseling actually in high school because I took a counseling style class when I was, I think, in junior year and really, really liked that and was like, hey, this is actually a profession that I could do where I would get to speak to people and learn about them and then work with them to work on the things that they're experiencing and the things that are going on in their lives. So I first discovered it when I was quite young. And then I went to college and studied applied psychology at NYU, which was really neat because we had field placements with licensed psychologists. And we also got to take counseling interview courses, which I think is pretty rare at the undergraduate level. And I just loved it because we got to feel and moonlight like what an actual therapist gets to do. And because I knew that I really wanted to go into the field and become a psychologist, it's always been kind of like this grounding path for me. And so I was able to step off the path for a couple of years to do things like teach English in Japan because I knew that I was planning to come back and then apply to grad school. And what really led to founding the Modern Asian Parent was that I think just being in clinical psychology, there's such an emphasis on intersectionality. It's what make us the people that we are. And I have a wonderful colleague and friend named Dr. Michelle Chung, who I had known for several years at that point. We both have private practices in New York City, and we had co-treated some different families and different cases together. And last year, we were just catching up. And we were recounting some of the cases that we work with and some of the general themes that we see. And we both work a lot with Asian families and just started noticing a lot of the same patterns and themes coming up for our clients. And a lot of times there were parents who might have been raised first gen or second gen and more in that like traditional model of parenting. And wanted to kind of cherry pick parts that really resonated with them, but maybe wanted to try something different. I think especially if they were coming from families that felt like achievement was really prioritized over everything else, or there was not that much validation and discussion of feelings in their households, but really weren't sure what to do. And we were like, you know what? We feel exactly the same way. Like it kind of took both of us becoming clinical psychologists to learn that language and learn those skills.
Yeah.
And so the idea for the Modern Asian Parent came up that, why don't we actually take what we do in our clinical work and create a model out of it and create essentially a community with resources based on what we ourselves do in our day-to-day, and try to basically get it out to the Asian parenting community, because they're, a lot of these skills are not always accessible. We kind of couldn't believe that it literally took being in graduate school to learn really the ins and outs of how to validate. And we're like, you know what? Like, we really need to share this information because we ourselves have really benefited.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I really appreciate you, one, sharing your journey into this. And there's so much of what you just said that resonates. I'm a 45-year-old woman and I feel like I am just learning the words validation and, what it means to be emotionally vulnerable, and to not always make achievement orientation like the way that in which I lead, at least with my children, but that it's a more sort of holistic approach. Why is it important to make the modern Asian parent a movement and not just limited to a set of solutions?
Yeah, well, I think parenting can sometimes in and of itself feel a bit isolating while also being part of a larger community. And we always think a lot about community. That I think within Asian culture, community is such a huge piece. It's really where I think a lot of us, myself for sure, get that sense of like belonging and strength. And I think, a big thing when we were really constructing what MAP was going to eventually look like was like, why don't we really help parents to feel like they're connected to other parents who are thinking similarly? I think sometimes when, we as parents are thinking about our own parenting styles, we might talk about it after the fact, but we don't necessarily always say like, hey, I'm actually like learning this new thing. Is this something that you're interested in? And so that has always been a really big mission of the Modern Asian Parent of like, hey, just even knowing that there are other people that are thinking the way that you are, that are learning, similar skills, can be just so helpful just to feel connected that, you're not doing this alone just with your family, that there are other people that are thinking about things in the same way. And I think like the other thing that I know we both really cherish a lot in our clinical work is that we really get to in depth form relationships with our clients. But, in terms of our reach, like we might work with 30, 40 families at a time. And when we were constructing this, we were really thinking about like, these things are not actually very well known, a lot of these skills, and definitely not within the context of Asian families. Yeah. So why not try to make our message a little bit bigger? And it's been such a humbling learning process for us trying to understand the internet, like creating community, like virtual community, in-person community. And I think it's just also been a wonderful experience for us to just grow. So I would say it adds so much to our personal day-to-days. So that piece has been really fun to feel like we're connecting with new people.
Yeah, it's almost like curiosity and change. It's just a little bit easier when you're doing it with other people that you feel safe exploring around. Could you define for some of us who might be new to this work, what does resilience and well-balanced actually mean? I mean, are there examples of this? This is something that I really struggle with sort of understanding and applying in my own sort of day-to-day parenting.
Absolutely. And I think resilience is such a wonderful term, but it's also pretty diffuse. So I think sometimes we understand it conceptually, but it's like when we actually really think about it, it's kind of hard to define it. I think it's twofold. There's the internal and the external. There's, that ability to trust ourselves internally that, even if something happens externally, like if there's a challenge that we didn't foresee, if there's something that we really need to show up for and accomplish or whatever it is, that we really trust ourselves and feel that sense of self-efficacy in order to be able to do that. And I think resilience is something that really develops with more experience when we face a challenging situation and we learned like, oh, actually my worst case scenario didn't happen. And I was able to do it maybe in an easier way than I predicted that I could. That actually ends up building a positive cycle. And what that does is that actually not only builds that sense of resiliency, but really does help to reinforce that trust that we feel in ourselves and that self-efficacy of like, hey, I can do it.
Absolutely. I know that feels, at least from my perspective, like it's for sure a learned skill and a skill that I continuously have to practice and think about. But being able to sort of impart or even pull that out of my own kids is a totally different scenario. For those who might be wondering, why would we want to parent any differently from previous generations?
Yeah, definitely. I always really bring it back to what works best for our own individual families. So for some families, they may want to parent in exactly the same way that their families raised them. That is wonderful. That is great. But really, I think for parents that feel like, hey, there were parts of it that I really cherish and feel like it really shaped me positively. And there were some practices that I maybe didn't really love as much. I think for those parents, that's something that we love actually approaching with a lot of curiosity. A big tool / concept that we use in the Modern Asian Parent is actually asking ourselves, Socratic questions, approaching some of the things that make us who we are with curiosity, and even just having some of those questions and thinking like, okay, like, how do I actually feel about my parents' parenting style? Are there things that I feel really great about that I want to make sure that I pass on to my children? Are there certain things that I feel kind of like neutral about? And are there things that I want to change? And actually by having that sit down, sometimes that's helpful just to see like, okay, like what things do I really want to protect as is? What can I take or leave? And then what things do I want to change? And so I think for those parents, those are oftentimes the ones that end up gravitating towards math of like, want to keep a lot of the amazing things, but there might be some things that just maybe don't feel like they resonate with me anymore.
Absolutely. What are some of the core values that we often associate with Asian parenting?
Yeah. So I think that there are so many different wonderful values. And I would definitely say that one has to do with, I think resiliency actually is a core value to a lot of parents. I think actually the sense of belonging is a theme and a value that we see that comes up quite often. I think within a lot of families that we work with, some amount of achievement tends to be a value. And that's sometimes one that we really focus on and give skills around because a lot of the families that we speak to might have been raised in some type of achievement-oriented family, be it was really explicitly taught or if it was something that was more implicitly implied. And I think sometimes what parents that we work with feel is like, okay, there were parts of achievement that just really didn't work for me. There was too much emphasis on grades. There was too much de-emphasis on things that I actually like to do. And that's something that when we talk about it within the MAP model, we say like, okay, so there is definitely a way to align with that value of achievement while also not saying like all A's or nothing. And one of the tools that I think is really helpful for that is actually focusing more on process goals rather than achievement goals. So, for example, if someone is playing volleyball, like maybe your child is playing volleyball and is trying out for the new high school team, that if their focus is only on achieving getting onto the team, that's really binary. So it's either like they're going to do it or they're not going to do it. But if we help them instead really focus on what is it like for you as a volleyball player? What are some things this summer as you're practicing that you want to work on? And it could be, I want to work on my overhand serve and hitting it further into the court. That actually is something, no matter what the outcome is, that's something that they can still feel proud of and is really great for that sense of self-efficacy.
Yeah, and I can hear both the blending of the Western and traditional Asian culture in that, because you're focusing on achievement as the value, but there's a massaging of it, if you will, and you're focused more so on the process as opposed to like the end goal. And to use your language, Dr. Laura, of sort of binary goal of either you achieved it or you didn't. And that reminds me, I've heard people say, to even in any sort of self-development process, to really enjoy the journey. And for a long time, I didn't really understand that.
Yes.
But I hear that very much in what you're saying right now, that this is really about teaching our kids to enjoy becoming as opposed to getting there. What are some of the strengths that you see in these values that you just shared? And where do they fall short in modern parenting, especially when it comes to the emotional component of parenting?
I think there are so many strengths, and actually a value like achievement really needs to be thought of within culture, meaning that achievement, especially for families that might be first generation, that is actually a value that's very protected in a lot of ways, right? It's in some ways like, how do we survive now that we're in a completely different, ecosystem where there's a different language being spoken, there are different larger systems and values, and that actually something like achievement is something that helps us to then navigate and assimilate into those larger systems almost like quicker. So I think that there is historically like a lot of strength related to, a value such as that. And I also think that something like resiliency is really tied into that. Like, how do we remain true to ourselves while also being able to navigate this new place where we are, now no longer in the majority, we're going into a completely different ecosystem. And I would say on the other side of things, their value itself is great, but I think it has to do a lot with how we communicate and what our expectations are around that value. So, in that really stereotypical sense, if we're really just emphasizing achievement over everything else, what can happen sometimes is that children can learn to actually de-emphasize their own personal strengths. It might be like, what if you have a child that's actually really creative and is an artsy kid, but then is hearing you have to go into STEM or you have to go into finance, that definition of achievement actually doesn't fully fit who they are as a person. And I think a drawback can be sometimes that they learn like, okay, that might just be a hobby, but this is really what I need to do in order to achieve. And so I think something that we really love to talk about at MAP is that emphasizing our children's strengths can be incredibly helpful because we want to build off of those rather than say that doesn't fit with my definition of what achievement should look like. And a lot of times when we're empowering and helping to build those natural strengths, it's really great for all of the internal things like that sense of self, sense of self-worth, sense of being able to contribute to their peers around them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, what I hear you saying is that it's really important to honor your child's strengths. And by honoring your child's strengths, I would feel seen, first of all. If someone said, Lindsay, I can tell that you are, a creative and artistic person and you love painting. I feel like I build an emotional connection to that person who's saying that to me. And that feels very different than the example that you shared. If we're trying to just tell the child to go into STEM. And I know I have been that parent. I'm like, STEM is very practical. You will get a good job. And I see it playing out in front of me right now as I'm telling my child that. And I mean, that's wonderful if your child is, wanting to go in that direction. And if your child is also, the painter or the sculptor or my daughter loves pottery. It's like I miss an opportunity to connect and to love my child if I only recognize STEM as the only pathway for her.
So true. And Lindsay, I think you put that so beautifully that I think ultimately as parents, a lot of us just want our children to really feel loved and to be able to just be themselves. And that actually by just encouraging those strengths, like that really does help to facilitate that feeling of, my parent is a safe person. Like I can be myself around them and I can trust them. And even if it's something that maybe doesn't fit their definition of something, that's okay. Like that I can still feel comfortable to voice what I'm thinking. And that's really what we're going for, and I think a lot of the MAP skills, we really concretely teach things like, how do you validate? Like, how do you validate while also maybe you have a different opinion and you don't want to agree, but then you also want to validate the feeling. That is really not just restorative of the parent-child relationship, but it helps to build it. And what we've seen in our work, and I've seen in some of my clients, is that I sometimes work with clients who were kind of pushed into certain jobs or certain fields that just really didn't gel with them as people. And later on in life, in their 20s or 30s, when they have more independence, are sometimes saying like, wait a minute, actually, I always wanted to be an artist and maybe I should go and do that. So I think actually if we can encourage our kids to really be thinking about who do I want to be and encouraging those strengths, that can also just help them to be growing on that path, rather than having that like, oh no, like what do I do next? And this doesn't feel like it's the right path for me. And then needing to autocorrect and figure it out.
Yeah. I feel like I experienced that even when I decided what to major in college. My parents didn't explicitly tell, you need to major in economics, but there was a voice in my head that said, this is the most practical thing. But, all of my friends will tell you a mathematician and economist is not what Lindsay should be. It's a true story. And, I think, if someone would have said to me or encouraged me or seen all of my strengths, or if I would have even valued that myself going into college, I don't know, maybe the outcome would have been different. Dr. Laura, could we move on to change starts with us? And this is something that is really hard for me because I will be honest, I have always believed pre-therapy, I have always believed that it was that person, and that person's fault for the way that I felt. And it wasn't until I really started to go do a lot of self-development in therapy where I began to understand that change starts with yourself. Why is that so important as we think about modernizing our parenting?
First of all, I love this as a concept because I think that is oftentimes in human nature for us to say like, wait, it was that person caused me to feel this way. So just want to validate that already, that I have those thoughts all the time. But, something that I find useful is to think about where our agency and our sphere of change actually is. And if we are thinking about trying to change other people, it's very difficult to do that, especially if someone doesn't really want to make that change. And then B, sometimes they need to decide to make changes themselves rather than us trying to make that change for them. We have the most agency over ourselves always to reflect and to make changes. And so it just kind of makes practical sense, as well as, I would say, emotional, spiritual sense, to start with ourselves, because when we can really think about what we might want to change in ourselves, and it could be something concrete, like it could be like, okay, I notice that I will sometimes really get on my kid if they haven't finished their homework that night. And I really want to take a step back and maybe work on regulating myself. Like, that's really actionable, right? And so I think when we're able to really break it down and make something actionable, not only does the change actually happen then, but then it really helps our sense of selves also, of like, I set my mind to something, I made the change, and like, hey, no one else told me to do that. I was actually the one who was able to do that for myself.
How does unresolved trauma or suppressed emotion in parents, how does that get passed down unconsciously?
I love this question so much, because I think, 2024 and 2025 has been such an expansive time for really understanding intergenerational patterns, trauma. And there's really like just a wonderful movement that's happening where I think it's really, a lot of people are beginning to think about their own families. And I think the answer is that it gets passed along in a lot of ways. When we think about how values or even trauma get passed down, a lot of times, sometimes it might be a singular moment, but a lot of times it could be small things that accumulate over time, so much so that they're kind of subtle. If we grew up in really invalidating environments, there might be specific times that were like, I remember when mom said that, and that did not feel good to me. But it's really indicative of potentially patterns that have actually existed over a period of time. So I think what's really helpful when really trying to do this work of even thinking about our own patterns or generational trauma that has been passed down is kind of twofold. One, if we're really grounding it in ourselves, is to think about what are some activating times, or what are some of my triggers, and like, when do I actually feel tense in my day to day? Because oftentimes the theory is that in our day to day, our bodies might actually be responding, and our central nervous system is actually responding to stress triggers. And what can sometimes be helpful is to really go into it and to see like, okay, like, how did it feel? How does it feel in my body? Like, are there any times in the past that I remember maybe activating that same feeling in my body? And just being one long line, it's almost like it folds in on past memories. I sometimes call that like the ribbon of life actually like folding on top of each other. And that trauma tends to be something that is not just like a one-off. Like, there might be almost like residual points that activate those initial feelings or those moments. I think for generational trauma, something that's helpful is even thinking about stories. So thinking about the stories that we might tell about maybe grandma moving to the United States, or when great grandpa was starting work and he was the only person of color, that actually paying attention to those stories, a lot of times there's emotional depth that's there, and there might be emotional pain that then actually has been passed on. And so I think when we're thinking about just healing some of those intergenerational pieces of trauma, it's so helpful to actually be able to not just approach it with curiosity, but to see and name some of the feelings that it makes us feel, like hearing, grandma went through that experience. How do I feel hearing that? Do I feel sad for her? Do I feel lost? And then also just even thinking, like, how did she feel when she was going through that? And an important question I love to ask is, based on that experience, is there anything that I need in this present moment to help me with that healing? And the answer could be yes, I need to delve into it. It could be, it's there. I know that I might want to process it, but maybe right now there's so much going on in my life that it might not be the best time for me. All of that's okay. And to just be curious about it and really try not to make any judgments about any reaction that you might have that might be coming up.
Laura, I want to just make sure that people understand what you just said. It's so important. So trauma is not just a singular event necessarily that can happen in someone's life. Like about big T trauma, like I survived like a natural disaster or God forbid some sort of assault. That trauma can actually be something small, like an interaction with mom or an interaction with grandfather that happens over a period of time. And it sounds like that actually compounds, like you described a ribbon of experiences. And it's important, it sounds like, to ask yourself, I had never thought about that, to ask yourself how you feel about learning about what maybe your grandparents went through, that is actually part of the healing process. But if you are not ready to actually process that for yourself, that is okay.
Absolutely. And I think, part of taking a trauma-informed approach for ourselves is actually helping us to be really in that driver's seat. I think sometimes it can feel like, big T trauma or little T trauma sometimes like robs us of that sense of agency. And so actually a huge part of that care is going to be saying like, hey, you're in the driver's seat here. There's something that maybe you want to process that can happen at any point. And then also to maybe think about when I actually do feel like I'm ready to process it, what do I feel like will help me to get ready? And a lot of times what I notice with MAP families or with my clients in practice is actually even just learning like emotion regulation skills. I think like a very common fear is what happens when I open the box? Like what happens if I can't handle it? And sometimes actually empowering ourselves to recognize that we have many more coping tools and strategies and ways to self-soothe than sometimes we may even recognize. That when we flop down to watch, a rerun of our comfort show, that is actually self-soothing. And really like starting off with just compiling what are things that when I feel upset help me feel calmer, and then actually pulling from some of those skills already. So you might notice even patterns. Like for myself, I'm a pretty sensory person. So I notice that when I'm able to intensify other senses, so, putting calming music on, having a candle, having like a fuzzy blanket, that I find that really soothing and calming. And actually just having those skills and just practicing them, not even necessarily for the purpose of being able to process the trauma later on, but just to even get used to that feeling of just literally being able to kind of give ourselves that warm hug. And that actually is a piece of reparenting, right? Like when you're feeling tense or when you're feeling stressed or maybe activated, how do you give yourself what maybe you wish that you could have gotten in that original moment? And what can you give yourself now?
I mean, it sounds like you just have to have so much grace and so much patience for your own healing process. When you're healing, it sounds like you just can't think of it from like and now I have to achieve it and have it done by next week on July 4th and be done with it.
It's so true. And to really treat it as being a journey. And I think it's one also, a question that I get a lot is, so how will I actually know if I've really healed? Like, what will it feel like. And it's definitely very different for every person. I think everyone has their own forms of healing. But something that I tell clients a lot is that there will be certain situations that maybe would have felt heavy or would have felt stressful. And it's just going to start feeling a little different. Like it might feel like you feel a little bit more like you're in the driver's seat for it. Or you might notice, I feel even just like 2 degrees less anxious when I step into that room. And that actually is part of the healing. We'll notice small things, and over time you might notice, oh wow, yeah, like that used to be really hard for me. And now it's still something that feels challenging, but I feel like I know what to do and I feel like I'm working my way through it.
Okay, Dr. Laura, many of us grew up in homes where parents never apologized. We just moved on. What is the emotional cost of an approach like that?
That is so resonating with me because I think that so many people, myself included, have experienced that. I'm like, oh gosh, this is bringing up memories. And I think it can very subtly, like a little chip on a rock, erode essentially the emotional safety and trust that is there in the family relationship, and also can slightly chip that actually family agency that like, hey, we can communicate through this and we can resolve it, even if there might be no actual resolution, but we can maybe come back and say like, I'm sorry, I said some things that I didn't mean. And that actually can help there to be some amount of emotional repair or resolution. So I think what's hard is that within families, families operate as systems. And sometimes it's like once the wheels are in motion, then patterns really form. And that can then become the pattern of just the communication style within the family. I always say it only takes one person to really start making a change in terms of communication and in terms of how they approach those situations. And then things can actually change, sometimes fairly quickly, sometimes slowly, because that person is not only making a change within the system, but is also modeling different language of like, oh, wait, we apologize now. Like, okay, like I can try that. Like I can also apologize and own what I said.
Can you explain what is repair and what is it not?
So there are a lot of different thoughts about, what repair is and is not. And to me, what repair is that sense of, being able to be heard in a moment where I think sometimes we may not have been heard in the past. And then what it's not is that sometimes it can feel like I'm just going to have to apologize for something that I didn't do in order to make that person feel better. True repair feels like, okay, we're coming in reciprocally and mutually and are able to speak to each other and move forward together rather than like reinforcing a power dynamic that is not super healthy.
Is part of the repair process, like me as a parent, something that my child is doing is just triggered something. And I know something I struggle with is like sort of hierarchical, I can never say that word, like parenting. And so when my kid doesn't listen, depending on what time of day, like I can pop off, and I know that it was much bigger, my reaction, than it actually needed to be. And I know I need to own that. How much of it is just me being triggered, like having my own emotional experience? Is that part of a dynamic that will require repair?
Yes, definitely. And I just want to validate that, it's so easy for me to say these things not in the moment, but, come 8 o'clock and it's been a long day, every parent is going to get activated. So I just really want to validate that, especially if there's anyone listening that's like, wait, I do that too. It's like, we all do it. It's normal. But I do think that it is a piece of this for sure. And actually, sometimes being able to take that step back and when things are calmer, coming to your kid and saying, hey, listen, I thought about it. I realized that I got activated. And I said some things that I regret saying. I wanted to just let you know that and say, I'm sorry. And what do you need to move forward? Having some form of that conversation, obviously at an age appropriate way. I think high schoolers can definitely tolerate a conversation at that level. But for someone in middle school or elementary school, we can simplify it and still explain and express like, hey, I'm actually taking ownership. Like, this is something that I'm working through, and ending with, and what do you need in order to feel safe, and what do you need to take care of your own emotional need? That actually really encourages our kids to be really thoughtful about their own emotional needs. So rather than feeling like, oh no, now mom is saying that all these things went wrong and now I need to help mom feel better, the emphasis on what do you need also really brings it back to that kind of like mutual reciprocity, and helps them to think about like, oh, mom actually values my emotional needs too, and she's asking me about it. And especially if we're starting from a pretty young age, elementary, middle school, they can definitely have these conversations. They then actually just have that vocabulary. And to me, I think that's such a wonderful gift, and they kind of are on their path to becoming emotional superheroes than we did.
I mean, everything that you just said is blowing my mind. Like, to even be asked the question as a child, what do you need? And I agree with you. Like, if we could teach our kids that this is what you can expect in a relationship. You're going to have fights. There's going to be disagreements. That's super normal. People are going to be tired at 8 o'clock. And so we are going to have some sort of situation. And it almost feels like the repair process is so critically important, because you're not going to have a perfect relationship. Like, that's the piece of the relationship that is going to reconnect, to build connection, to build love, to build emotional safety. And that's an incredibly healthy relationship dynamic. Yeah.
So true. I couldn't agree more. And I think that was so well put. I loved how you framed that.
The last question I want to ask, where can people find you? And also, what are some exciting projects that the Modern Asian Parent is working on right now?
Yeah, so we have a lot that we're working on. And the way to reach us is we have a website called themodernasianparent.com. And we have a lot of free resources, free worksheets, workbooks, and different talks on parenting topics that we have done over time. We also have an Instagram account, The Modern Asian Parent, and we have a newsletter that we send out like once every week, actually, where we break down different parenting tips and trends. Dr. Michelle Chung and I both have our own private practices, and we actually have we both have our own Instagram accounts too. So hers is Dr. Chung, and mine is Dr. Laura B Therapy. And if anyone listening has any questions for me, please feel free to reach out to me. My website is drlaurab.com. And we have many exciting things coming up. One of the things is that we're actually writing a book right now, and we are in the process of actually finalizing things, and we'll be working on that this summer. So we're very excited. And we just actually got 501c status. And so we're really thrilled to be joining the nonprofit world, and are hoping, to be applying for some grants to, build out our programming. So this fall, we'll have a lot more parenting webinars coming up. We'll have some in-person events in New York, as well as New Jersey. So please stay tuned on our website for that. And we are always writing. So we'll probably be writing some new curriculum as well. So lots of fun things coming up.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I would encourage everyone listening to reach out to follow the Modern Asian Parent and all of the amazing activities and community functions, both online and in person. If you are in the New York and New Jersey area, the information is so incredibly valuable. And I'm so grateful to both you and Michelle for really recognizing the gap, the parenting development space, because it's so important to have people helping you along the way and to do so in community. And so for that, I am so grateful to the both of you for launching this amazing initiative. So thank you, Laura. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Courage Class. I hope today's conversation gave you a little encouragement and inspiration. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And for extra motivation, tools, and behind the scenes content, sign up for my newsletter. I'd love to share with you more there. See you next time.